Oh, thank you very much, Kathy, and to your team for inviting me today. I'm going to share the screen and work through some slides together. And yeah, this is where we are. And can everyone see that all right? Okay. Yeah, so thank you for the land acknowledgement. I myself are in the unceded territory of the Kanien'kehá:ka here in Tiohtià:ke, Montreal. But myself, I was born on Vancouver Island on Coast Salish territory. And I think it's really important to acknowledge the the peoples that have lived on the lands where we are now for generations, really thousands of years, and who've taken care of the land so that um, we have sustenance today. I also like to acknowledge the elders, the ancestors, and Mother Earth herself, because without that great body, we wouldn't have anywhere to be. So I'm happy to be here with you all today. This is me. I have to make a point of shortening my biography. It's going to take up half the presentation if I don't do something about that. But yeah, I guess I'm a member of the Métis Nation. My mom is from Fort Chipewyan in northern Alberta, and I moved to this area um, in 2014 to teach at uh, the University of Montreal. And now I'm at Concordia University. I'm the director of First Peoples Studies, but my heart is always in practice and counseling and, of course, violence prevention. So, this is our team at the Center for Response Based Practice. So, really, the work was developed by Nick Todd, who's not here, Alan Wade, and Linda Coates. And then I joined on a bit later, and Shelley Bonna, now Shelley Dean. So we've been the center and offering different kinds of services and training, and yeah, doing work that I find to be very meaningful, probably for the last 25, 30 years together now. And I'll just say that this approach is I guess a grandchild of, you could say, systemic family therapy, feminist practice, which invited an analysis of power in the room, and post-colonial and anti-colonial writings, memoir, um, informed a lot by the accounts of political prisoners, including Indigenous former children who were in residential schools, and really conversations with women in the context of therapy. And what Alan Wade recounts is that, he went to counseling school and he'd be in the room there, and there'd be a woman telling him about how she was being um, beaten or harmed by her husband. And he would ask the typical counseling question, like, how did that make you feel, or something like that. And he noticed that women were refusing to answer that question, um, maybe partly because it's so obvious, but they want to tell him what they did, and they actually were quite proud of it. And then when he did this, I did this, and then I did this and this and this. And he realized that women wanted to talk about how they had resisted the violence, how they had responded to the violence. And it really highlighted, their safety knowledges, their pre-existing ability, capacity, everything they learned basically from dealing with violent men. And that was something to actually, be proud of, not to be happy that women are in those situations, but that we learn how to navigate them, and so have our mothers and grandmothers. And so we started developing the ideas further. So I'll just give a little content warning for the presentation. I don't use lots of descriptive violence, but I also like this approach when we read Zora Neale Hurston. She says, "I do not weep at the world. I'm too busy sharpening my oyster knife." Meaning that as women and as people who are often attacked by violence, we're constantly honing our skills of resistance and strategizing and developing tactics and deciding, okay, how are we going to deal with this next thing, whether it's an attack on a woman or a two-spirit person, and there's impunity for the perpetrator, or there's a new law that's unjust for women that creates the conditions where violence can happen. We're on our toes. Obviously there's moments of pain as well, but there's a lot of moments of righteous indignation, outrage, and we have to keep working. And so I invite everyone to do what they already know how to do to take care of themselves. If you're here today, you probably know a lot about taking care of yourself and what to do when emotions come up. And also invite you to think about your family's history of resistance to oppression. Whether you're Indigenous or not, many families came to Canada trying to escape some kind of oppression in another part of the world. And it was often a long and arduous journey to get to safety. So, yeah, we can look to our grandparents and our great grandparents and see how they navigated these challenges and realize that if you're here in the room today, your family survived in a direct line from the time of uh, the first inhabitants on this planet, and that's no small feat. So we have something in our bodies and in our historical memory and DNA that has kept us strong and here, right? So just to give a little bit of the context in Canada anyway, um, I'll just read it. A society that denies the violence of its colonial past. And so remember that Prime Minister Harper said that Canada has no history of colonialism. Of its colonial past and present cannot be relied upon to respond adequately to any form of violence. Instead, the institutions of that society can be relied upon to conceal the violence and related forms of administrative domination, to obscure or fully conceal the responsibilities of the people in power or the system who've perpetrated violence, to conceal the ongoing and multifaceted resistance of those who have been victimized, and blame and pathologize those who have been victimized as deficient others, using colonial folk terms and the formal language of the colonial institutions. And unfortunately, that means some of our mental health frameworks. One of the things you'll notice if you look at a pamphlet from almost any center, it'll talk about resilience. But it won't talk about resistance, because resilience as a term is often individualized, and it does not imply that the person actually did anything to resist because that's too threatening for a lot of our institutions. So for example, if you read some of the apology from former Prime Minister Harper, he'll refer to the past as a sad chapter in our history, but he won't talk about all the things that Indigenous people did, for example, to resist the oppression and violence of the colonizers, because that points to the actual level of brutality. And we find that in lots of other ways too. For example, women's resistance is often pathologized or recast as signs of disorder. And you probably all know this, but most women who report uh, having been violated end up with a personality disorder if they go to get help. So there's different ways that the system actually sort of blames and pathologizes women victims of violence and other non-men. So I don't know if some of you remember this poster. It says, class consciousness is knowing which side of the fence you're on, and class analysis is knowing who's there with you. I just thought that was a lovely look back to my youth. So, as the writer Anne Shvekovich writes, what if depression in the Americas, at least, could be traced to histories of colonialism, genocide, slavery, legal exclusion, and everyday segregation and isolation that haunt all of our lives, rather than to be biochemical imbalances? What if we're just refusing to be contented with violence, not that we're depressed, right? If we need to externalize a negative force, it should be colonization, right? Um, Not that there's something wrong with our individual minds, because as you know, those who choose to perpetrate violence, those who, for example, who choose to harm women or children, they know that they have a problem they have to overcome, and that is that the victim is going to resist the violence. So they need to suppress the victim, the victim's resistance in advance. So, that's why um, people that want to harm children, they'll pretend they're really nice, they'll get to know the parents, they'll give gifts, and they'll sort of nurture a relationship of trust. And so those are ways to suppress the violence. For example, when men are trying to harm their wives, they'll often tell family and friends that their wife is mentally unstable, or she lies, or she's a bad mom, or something, in order to harm her reputation, so that when she actually goes to report the violence, nobody will believe her. So these are kind of strategies that we need to take into account. What happens before the actual violence, in order for the perpetrator to get there and have impunity. So in our work, we talk a lot about dignity. We actually center response-based practice on the idea of dignity. It's something that we're all born with. It's connected to our spirit and our life force. Um, but also there are non-human or more than human forms of dignity. In an indigenous worldview or a pagan worldview, we consider the relationships with the trees and the birds and the waters and the elements, all these aspects of Mother Earth. They have dignity and life force as well. But in terms of human dignity, we understand that things like body sovereignty is important, the freedom to make decisions for our own life, the freedom without impairment to care for our loved ones, whether they're children or elders. Poverty can be a serious form of indignity and humiliation, those kinds of things. So the thing to keep in mind is whenever somebody's hurt, there's a form of humiliation that goes along with that. And so part of our work as helpers is to assist the person to restore their dignity after they've been embarrassed or humiliated, or their reputation has been damaged publicly. So Nelson Mandela talked about this. He realized that different nations valued dignity or respect or that kind of thing in a slightly different way. He says, I learned my lesson one day from an unruly donkey. We had been taking turns climbing up and down on its back when my chance came, and I jumped on, and the donkey bolted into a nearby thorn bush. It bent its head, trying to unseat me, which it did, but not before the thorns had pricked and scratched my face, embarrassing me in front of my friends. Like the people of the East, Africans have a highly developed sense of dignity, or what the Chinese call face. I had lost face among my friends. Even though it was a donkey that unseated me, I learned that to humiliate another person is to make him suffer an unnecessarily cruel fate. Even as a boy, I defeated my opponents without dishonoring them. So that really speaks to the power or the sting of humiliation, and how it can actually influence our lives in different ways. And so again, helping people to restore their sense of self-worth or dignity after that's been robbed from them, it's one of our most important tasks. So dignity in social life. So most of you probably remember when we were young, if we ate in a way that our parents thought was disrespectful or rude, they would correct us. And if we went to Aunt Martha's house and she made us some dinner, and we said, our parents said, oh, thank Aunt Martha for the delicious spaghetti, and you said, no, I don't like it. uh, in the old days, you'd probably get a slap across the head, but parents would say, no, you can't say that, you have to be nice, because there's this sense in society that we have to work to make people feel better, like to preserve their dignity, to tell people they look nice in that dress, to laugh when they tell a joke that died on the vine and really wasn't very funny. But we do these things all the time just to keep the sort of harmonious social relations going, and because we don't like to hurt, we don't like to see people hurt. In our practice, we can develop our own ways of understanding if somebody sitting in front of us is feeling dignified in the interaction, by how they look, how they're holding their body, their posture, the light in their eyes, whether they're looking at us or away, all those kinds of things. And we can even ask them, um, was this helpful for you today? Or how did this go, this conversation that we just had? That kind of thing. We can check in around it. So what is violence? Well, it's important that we acknowledge that it's unilateral. It's when one person acts against the will and well-being of another. I mean, two people can agree to go into a boxing ring together and start punching each other. But that's actually consensual if we're talking about boxing. But when somebody's hurting another person, and there's often a power differential, or the bigger person or stronger person or more aggressive person may also have more backup or weapons, that's violence. There's typically two or more people, it's non-consensual, and most of the time it's deliberate. And so what is resistance? It's whatever a person does or thinks or feels in a way that shows their opposition to violence. And we know that resistance itself can seldom stop the violence, because the aggressor is often, like I said, bigger, stronger, or has weapons. But it does serve to attend to our dignity. That's why some people, they got to have the last word. They'll yell something which maybe could keep the danger going or the violence going, but it's just really important for them. I'll just tell you a little story of a woman that came for counseling. She told of being able to tell her husband's mood by how the car tires on the driveway sounded. So if he would sort of screech in, get out and slam the car door, she would think, oh no, I can tell what this is going to be like. So he'd come into the house and sort of stomp up the stairs, and he had one of those silver metal lunch kits, and he slammed it down on the counter beside her and said, you're not showing much imagination with my lunch these days, are you, bitch? And she just stood there washing the dishes, like sort of not looking at him and knowing that she couldn't say anything or move because he'd probably hit her. So then he leaves, and she gets on with her stuff. And so the next day he goes to work, and he goes for lunch with his workmates, and he takes out the sandwich, and he takes a bite of it, and he notices something feels strange. So he opens up the pieces of bread, and there's a piece of paper there, and it said, imagine this is cheese. So of course he wasn't pleased, and he let her know it later on, but she said, that kept me going for months. So that's just an example. Sometimes we even put our dignity before safety, just to restore something in ourselves in really humiliating circumstances. So what is resistance? Basically, it's any mental or behavioral act through which a person attempts to expose, withstand, repel, stop, prevent, abstain from, strive against, impede, refuse to comply with, or oppose any form of violence or oppression, or including disrespect, and the conditions that make such acts possible. And that's why so many people, and often women, uh, will go to the streets and protest when there's a change in law that increases the likelihood that women and non-men could be violated and get away with it. Right? So, for many victims, humiliation is the primary affront, the most lasting and painful injury. So, one woman said, "The bruises go away, but you never forget what he said to you, or he got my body, but he didn't get me." So, responses and resistance are often oriented to preserving and asserting dignity, and the violence may be only the first in a series of indignities delivered through social responses. So, that's the other key point of response based practice. And I'm not sure I'll get to elaborate on that too much in this short presentation, but something bad might happen to us, something might hurt us, but then when we go to disclose, it's so important how other people handle the disclosure, because if they do not handle it correctly, our suffering increases and we're more likely to actually um, receive a psychological diagnosis of a mental illness. We're more likely to be, I guess you could say, severely depressed or even suicidal. There's a quote here by Andrews, Bruin, and Rose, and they say, although men and women victims of violent crime were just as likely to report having received positive support and having been satisfied with it, women were more likely to report negative responses from family and friends. This difference in level of negative responses appeared to explain the gender difference in PTSD symptoms 6 months post crime. So, one of the ways we receive a negative social response is if somebody minimizes it, they don't believe us, they blame us, or they use other kinds of language to say, cast it as a mutual act rather than a unilateral act, that kind of thing. So I'll go on and hopefully get to touch on that again soon. So resistance is a response, it's not an effect. But when you go to a counseling school or you get a degree in psychology, you can look up so many disorders or conditions, or open the DSM, and you'll hear this word, this is an effect of something. And so we don't talk like that. We don't really study effects other than the material effects. So say you're robbed, uh, an effect of that is that you are perhaps walletless or purseless. Somebody has taken your money, and that's a reality. You don't have a wallet anymore. That's a material effect. If through colonialism somebody comes and they steals your indigenous land, that landlessness is an effect. But how you feel about it, or what you do about it, or think about it, those are all human responses, and they require having a system of values and being able to make meaning of a situation. So when we interview people, we would never ask them, how were you affected by that? We would try to elicit basically what they did in the context, how they analyzed the context, how they made certain decisions to act, and what that all meant to them. Okay, so we have this framework for understanding events in the social world. And I'll just try to go through it quickly because it's actually quite important. We use this framework for how to interview people or how to write a report. We'll put these as the report headings, or how to analyze basically any situation. Because one of the problems we get in psychology school is that so many of the conditions are actually decontextualized. Just to give a little example, I was sitting in my counseling office one day in Montreal looking out the window, and I saw a man, and he was talking to a mailbox, and he was vigorous conversation, gesticulating. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. This man is having a conversation with the mailbox. And so later, when I left the office, I looked and there was a short woman standing behind the mailbox. And I thought, oh, he's having a conversation with a short woman that I could not see from the other side. And that's so much of the problem in situation analysis. If we don't have a 360-degree view, or we don't understand what's going on in the context, then it's really hard to understand and intervene properly. And so my colleague Cheryl Henry and I, we just wrote a new program for the Canadian Mental Health Association called We Are Indigenous, and it's a Indigenous version of the program. They have a parent support program to deal with what they call anxiety. And so we changed it to focus on Indigenous strong spiritedness and, our survival capacity and tactics. But one thing that stood out so much for us is if a little child did not want to go to school, we would maybe say that they're anxious about going to school, and then we would do something with them to try to relieve their anxiety, like CBT or something. But the real issue is that in our histories, school has meant prison camp. School has meant forced separation from your mother. School, even today, can mean I'm getting targeted there. Some people call it bullying. We could call it also sexism, racism, girl massage, whatever it is. But when we decontextualize it, we take the problem and put it in the mind of the victim, and then we try to treat the mind of the victim. So my colleague Alan Wade has been saying, we've been trying to address men's violence for years by tampering with the minds of women, and it hasn't worked. So in order just to get the context, we start with looking at the social material conditions, and then we go to the situation interaction. And then within that, there's usually an act of perpetration. So we look at how the victim responded or resisted, and how other people responded when they found out. And then so how the victim and the offender both respond to other people's responses. So just to give you a more concrete example, when I'm teaching this to my students, in regard to the social material conditions, I might say, where you live, who's most likely to get away with a crime that they committed? Who's most likely to get away with that? And where you live, who's most likely to be blamed for a crime that they did not commit? Because wherever we have ethical leadership, whether it's in the mainstream or in an Indigenous community or wherever it is in organizations, whenever we have ethical leadership, women and children and non-men are safer. But whenever we have corrupt or unethical leadership, women and children and non-men are much less safe. So that's an important place to be. What are the power dynamics like in your community or organization, that kind of thing? So the situation interaction, that means under this roof or under this ceiling, what is the subculture there? Where you go to work or in your home, is it a place of care and respect and, sort of a loving atmosphere? People enjoy each other's company. If it's a workplace, do people go out together socially? Do they have lunch together now and then? Do they support one another? Or is it a subculture where people throw each other under the bus, and it's highly competitive, or maybe people report on each other, that kind of thing? So that really makes a difference to how much and whether or not acts of violence can be committed in that context. So given that, we see the action of an offender. So I used to work in the Yukon quite a lot with the Kaska women of the Liard Aboriginal Women's Society. So imagine me driving down the unpaved road there, my rental vehicle, and that I see an Indigenous woman walking down the road, and she has two different shoes on her feet. And then I'm thinking, because I'm a trained professional, oh, so what could be the issue here? Is she colorblind? Does she have a bad fashion sense? Did the dog eat some of her shoes. Was she in a hurry? Whatever. And then I find that she lives with a man who is denigrating and controlling of her. And every morning before he goes to work, he takes one of each of her shoes and puts it in the trunk of his car because he doesn't want her to go out. He doesn't want her to have contact with family, friends, or community members. And so, what does she do? She just grabs any shoes that fit on the feet and she walks downtown to do her business. And so people like me drive by. How do we respond? Did I worry for her? Did I help her? Did I offer her a ride? Did I offer to buy her a new pair of shoes? And what did the other people do? Because in my experience, it's just as likely that somebody could drive by and open the window and yell racial slurs at her or chuck a beer bottle at her. So how do others respond? So imagine she goes to a social service office and there's a woman working there and she goes in. She says, hello, I'd like to have an appointment with a social service worker. I would like to get some funding. I want to leave my husband and take my kids and move to another town, so I need money for a new apartment. So the social service worker says, yes, no problem, right away, ma'am. Just have a seat, help yourself to a glass of water, and I'll be back in 5 minutes. So the worker goes in the back, and then she comes out with a check for $8,000 and she hands it to the woman and says, here you are, ma'am. Have a nice, safe life. And so how does she respond to that social response? Well, she could probably cry. She might give her a hug. She might say, thank you. You've made such a difference to my life. She might go buy her some flowers, that kind of thing. But as we know, unfortunately, women and marginalized people and non-men often receive what we call negative social responses. They're often sent in this context to parenting courses or self-assertion courses, or blamed in some way as if it's her fault that she's being harmed, and often does not get the kind of financial support that she needs so that she could just pack up and leave and be safe. Obviously, there's other options, but it's not that easy. And then if the perpetrator finds out what she's doing, he's also going to take more steps to block her in her actions, which is why lots of women choose to leave very, very carefully. They might make longer term plans. They know that it's after they leave that they're more likely to be murdered, both them and their children. And so they often wait until there's more positive social responses, till they have more offers of concrete support from family and friends, resources, a place to go that's safe, all those kinds of things. Because in the meantime, it's actually safer for her and sometimes to stay, because she can see how the offender or the aggressor is interacting with her children and she wants to keep her children safe. But we know sadly that often women are blamed for staying and told, like, you should leave because he's hurting you. So it just shows, this helps us to analyze a situation, and we recommend aligning with the will and well-being of the victim and trying to support whatever decisions they make in that moment. So context involves getting accurate descriptions and try to be culturally specific as well. If we're working across cultures, it's really important to understand the values of the other culture. And for example, what will happen to them if they're suddenly unmarried or living without a husband in a culture where women are meant to be married, for example. So there's a lot of stigma and judgment and blame that can be very difficult if she leaves the violent situation right away. So before I start on this, I just want to check in. How am I doing for time there?
You have 3 minutes.
3 minutes. Okay.
3 or
So,
maybe 5. We'll give you
oh,
5.
sure. I just want to say that language is really important. Shit happens and how we talk about it matters. And Alan and Linda did some research on courts and court documents, and they found, but also studying newspapers and social studies textbooks and all sorts of different forms. And they found that these four operations typically to go together. In the mainstream, we conceal violence, we hide it. Often there are accounts without perpetrators. Like one judge said, the fight followed them down the hallway. So then the responsibility for like who did what to whom is gone, and you can't see how the victim resisted. And then if the victim is the only person left in the sentence, we often blame them or interact with them, even like in child protection. She'll become the target of the intervention because he's not around or whatever. So we reverse this and we try to make the violence clear, who's doing what to whom, and hold the perpetrator accountable, highlight the acts of resistance and the responses of the victim and the children, and not blame, but align with them. We use accurate language. So we don't like a term like abusive relationships. It doesn't really tell us who's doing what to whom. We used to say wife assault or beating. I sometimes use mother assault. We just have to make sure we're not using mutualized language. If somebody attacks us in the workplace, it's not a personality conflict, right? That kind of thing. What we called like international, we should be talking about sex tours as or child sex tourism as international child rape, for example, to use the language. And so I don't really talk about trauma very much. I understand that people use the word out of basically respect and politeness. They know that a whole bunch of bad things has happened to somebody and they don't want to name them or bring them up. So they'll say she's experienced a lot of trauma. But we say that, trauma is something that exists in the mind of a victim, whereas violence exists in the society, and we have to address the problem of violence, right? Not just tamper with people's minds. We need to create social justice. We need to create safe spaces. So I'll just end with this because so often we talk about gender-based violence, which I think means that as long as we have genders, we'll have violence. And we don't have men's violence anymore. We have we use these terms: intimate partner violence, domestic violence, family violence, but we don't say men's violence. And for me, that's sort of like the use of articles in the French language, right? You can have 100 women and they are L, like ELLES. But the minute one man shows up, then they all get changed to the masculine pronoun, which is ill, ILS. And it's sort of like that for every 17 men that attack a woman, there might be one woman who actually attacked her male partner. But we can't talk about men's violence anymore. If we don't address if we don't name the violence properly, it's really hard to develop a way to address it or intervene in a good way. And it also perpetuates mutualization, like, oh, everyone's violent, women are violent too. And it's not really like that. First of all, we have to decide the difference between violence and self-defense. And we have to understand that most women who are in jail for murdering a man, they got there because nobody had their back, and they understood that if they didn't fight back with violence or aggression, that they would be killed. So also, just to acknowledge that if you interview men who've been targeted by their female partners, they'll often say that they didn't end up in the hospital with serious damages to their body, but also that they don't really fear their partner. So we can't equate these things. So I'm just giving an example of how we really need to address who's doing what to whom. And sometimes we have to name it, like genocide in Canada is not just a sad chapter of our history. It's a founding aspect of the violence that happened on this land, right? So I'll end with this Australian comedian Aziz Ansari. He says, if you believe that men and women have equal rights, and then someone asks you if you're a feminist, you have to say yes, because that's how words work. You can't be like, yeah, I'm a doctor who primarily does diseases of the skin. Oh, so you're a dermatologist. Oh, that's way too aggressive of word. Not at all, not at all. So just a little humor at the end there. So thank you for listening, everybody. And I hope that gave you a little taste of what response-based practice looks like, and our orientation to social justice, and safety and dignity, uh, rather than just trying to fix people's minds who've already been hurt, right?
Thanks for your presentation, Cathy. That was extremely interesting. I would like to open up the, I was going to say field, open up the Q&A session. My blood sugars are low. I need to have lunch. So if anyone has any questions in the audience, please put it in the Q&A section.
Yeah, or a reflection even.
Yeah, that's a good point.
I don't mind challenge, but sometimes we have to have different orientations.
Fair enough.
Yeah, yeah.
That sandwich question, or that sandwich anecdote about resisting with the slice of paper, the slice of cheese, really had me guffawing over. It also had me reflecting on how, like, even just the little ways in how we in ourselves will, it's this type of resistance is it's a way of asserting ourselves and really, showing our self-confidence and being able to exert that. But when you're in an abusive relationship, that's really what the abuser is trying to extinguish, right? That willingness to, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and as somebody who does family therapy, and I've also taught it, I think in a way we really have to critique this idea of intergenerational transmission, because it's so one-sided. They talk about intergenerational effects of trauma, or intergenerational trauma, whatever. There's lots of things that people talk about, but they never really study intergenerational dignity, or internet intergenerational resistance knowledges. Like, how did all the women in your family deal with difficult men? Like, there's knowledge there, and it really gets applied to residential school survivors, and it negates everything that they actually did to try to um, preserve culture and connection. For example, children were not allowed to talk to their brothers and sisters, right? And so they would secretly meet when the bell rang between classes. They'd go to a really busy area, and they'd sit, and they'd go and they'd talk to their brother or sister there. They might give him some food or a note, or they might talk to them in their own language. And they found all these ways to try to keep connected. And then you get to be an adult, and people say, oh, I don't know how to parent, because it's so in the culture. You don't know how to parent because you were parented by nuns and abusive priests, and so therefore we're going to remove your children. And it's so one-sided. You don't say, well, wait a minute, I learned how to keep the love alive for my family. I learned how to meet them. I could sneak into the younger girl's dorm at night and give my sister a little hug, and I could sing a song to her in our traditional language, and then I'd sneak back. Like, all that is left out when we don't look at how people actually respond. And so this is about um, aligning with pre-existing ability, capacity. And to all the neuropsych people, I say, have you studied the brain, the neural pathways of dignity or collective care or love? Because we tend to over focus on the negative and what we perceive as being broken. And so I resist the reduction of every human experience and our suffering and our brokenheartedness to something up here, whereas we used to talk about the heart.
Mm.
We used to talk about like the whole body, and the poets talked about suffering through beautiful language and song. You know, it was such a rich and multifaceted way to really talk about human suffering. And now it's just, oh, they're traumatized. We have to resist that kind of reduction of the human experience. And women have been, um, dealing with the difficulties um, of men's violence for a long, long, long time, right?
Thanks for that. I think that that's a really important point, Cathy, about the overemphasis on the intergenerational transmission of violence and not the transmission of resistance and dignity. One of the writers that I find has been really helpful for me is Katerina Vermeet's
Oh,
novels, like The
yeah.
Break and The Stranger. She's got one more that I can't wait to read, but it really was one of the first times I was able to understand the love and the support that in Métis women give one another in the midst of violence. Not just intimate or interpersonal violence, but colonial violence. And it just I was recommending the book to somebody, and they're not a domestic violence researcher, and they were like, "Oh my God, this is just like so hard." And I'm like, but in the midst of all of the domestic violence literature that many of us read or draw upon, this is really very different, her approach, right? Like, I don't know if you're familiar with her work, but it was like your talk and reading her stories were just so helpful, right? Like that, because we really have to shift our gaze, shift our understanding and our perspective away from trauma and the kinds of things we look for, because we're trained to look for those things, right?
Yeah.
And start to see other aspects of situations that are hidden from our view, like you started off with your example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Catherine, she says, she is not the harm, she's the healing, which is a really nice way to look at someone in their process, right? And I don't know if a lot of people are not aware of it, but when you get we're often forced to get a diagnosis in order to get services. But when you get a diagnosis, it means that you are mentally ill in Canada. And in a way, it means the perpetrator has won because they reduced you to a mentally ill person, which, according to the Canadian Mental Health Act, it's almost like you're not an adult. So you lose your children or you lose your land. People think, oh, you're not capable because you're mentally ill. And men are using it in court when they're fighting for their children.
Mhm.
They're saying, oh, my wife or my ex-wife, she's mentally unstable. She has a mental illness. So that's where we end up when we
Mhm.
talk like that. Yeah. So of course I'm not in favor of talking like.
Veronique comments. She says, "I just wanted to say thank you for this presentation. The importance of seeing the entire picture, to not just focus on the tip of the iceberg, but on the entirety when you are working with an individual, and how to do so in a way that empowers and helps honor and recognize the dignity. I appreciate the way you reframe some of the harmful narratives." Yeah, I
Thank
agree.
you, Dominique.
Yeah.
Appreciate that. Yeah, I remember reading at a conference a quote from a book. It was called The Emotionally Abused Woman. And it goes on, the emotionally abused woman is dot dot dot, and it says all these bad things about her. And then I stopped and I said, wait a minute, is there like one woman in this room who's not been emotionally
Yeah.
abused? Like, this is not a category. They're talking about all of us. And so much of this psychological language is actually hate speak against women.
Mm.
I mean, I could give you more examples if we had a longer time together, but we can't talk about people like, I don't know, in society it's been accepted to talk like that about women, but you can't talk that way about racial groups, right? Or
Yeah.
you'll get
Yeah.
attacked. But why are women fair game?
Mm. I'll leave it at that.
Okay.
On that note, we have I wanted to, as we wrap up, I wanted to acknowledge that this year is the MMFC's 30th anniversary. And hosting events like this, this webinar series and hosting research projects wouldn't be possible without the work of and the contribution of the Ferguson Foundation. So I will invite Norma Dubé to just say a few words and ask some asking, and I'm going to share a little PowerPoint slide here. Norma, you're on deck.
Okay, can you hear me? Yes. Many buttons appeared at the same time. For about 40 years now, the Ferguson Foundation has really committed itself to being a catalyst in the prevention and elimination of family violence. We do that through various fundraising activities to support the work, such as the work done by the Muriel McQueen Center for Family Violence Research. Yearly, we provide an award for either an individual or an organization who's really made a significant contribution to the cause that I think really resonates with all of us here today. This year, we've chosen Deborah Westerberg, and for our colleagues from New Brunswick, you will certainly recognize the name. Deborah really worked for years and years and years at the grassroots level, at the transition house level, accompanying women who lived the journey that was described by Catherine in many ways during her presentation. The ceremony is actually later this week, Thursday, for anybody who's interested in attending. It's at the Government House at 11 o'clock on Thursday. You're all invited. Hope to see you there for those who can actually travel to Fredericton. And I'd also just would like to put in a bit of a plug because 2024 is around the corner. Note that we will be doing our Food and Wine Gala again as our major fundraiser in November of next year. Stay tuned to our social media for when the tickets go on sale because they sell out very quickly. So if you're interested, you have to be quick on the draw. You can actually contribute yourselves to the work that the foundation does, and in return to the work that the center does. You can go to our website. There's a donate button. We'd love to receive your donations anytime you wish to make them. And with the holidays coming up, it's a great time to do that sort of thinking. I would like to close by thanking Catherine. I am not a researcher. I am not an academic person. I loved your presentation, Catherine. You spoke to the real person, the real reason that I've been involved in this cause for more years than I care to remember, actually. But you made it really, really real. And I appreciate that. And I'm sure the people who participated in the webinar also feel that way. Thank you to the Center for organizing this. Thank you for the work and the contributions you've made over the last 30 years. As Denis noted, this is your 30th anniversary. And finally, but not last, thank you for all of those who participated. Without you, we really would have no reason to provide these knowledge transfer activities. The center appreciates your participation, and so do we at the foundation. So thank you all. Have a great rest of day.
All right. And with that, we are done. So thank you very much, everyone, and have a nice rest of your day.